We are continuing to go through St. Ignatius's rules for discernment of spirit to help us to be able to sort through the ups and downs of our spiritual life. Life is a mixture of consolation and desolation. We're going to experience both of those. So, as I've mentioned before, there's no shame in experiencing desolation. In fact, last time we talked about rule number 9. We talked about the 3 reasons why God may allow us to go through desolation. Could be our fault, but then we also talked about 2 reasons that it's not our fault. That God is trying to do things specifically within us to help mature our love for Him and recognize His consolations more easily. And so today we're going to look at Rule 10 and 11. They were actually pretty short rules overall. Rule 10 is about planning ahead when we're in consolation for the future times of desolation. So St. Ignatius says, "Let one who is in consolation think how he will conduct himself in the desolation which will come after, taking new strength for that time." So these are those wonderful moments where we're feeling God's closeness. It's easy to pray. It's easy to do our spiritual practices that are leading us closer to the Lord. During those times, God is pouring His love into us to strengthen us. And we want to draw strength for the future times when it becomes more difficult to follow Him. And it seems like God's far away during those times of desolation. When Jesus does this, we find in the Scriptures as well. Toward the beginning of Lent each year, we read, I think should be the second Sunday of Lent, we read the story of the Transfiguration. When Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up the high mountain, and He's glorified in front of them, they see it's to prepare them for the coming passion that will be. So this experiencing Jesus in His glorified form helps them during the time when it seems that all is lost in His crucifixion. He does the same thing at the Last Supper, and He tells them, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. Have faith that you have faith in God. Have faith also in me." Right? So this time of consolation, when they feel Jesus' closeness at the Last Supper, it's to sustain them for the next day on Good Friday when they feel God's far away, and literally, they run away from Him, and to try to avoid, the exterior suffering, but of course, then there's the interior feeling of alone because they've separated themselves from God. So the same way for us, He can give us times of consolation, and recalling that is to strengthen us during the times of desolation. So, what kind of things can we do to prepare ourselves for times of desolation? Well, in times of consolation, we can think back to a number of the pieces of advice that Ignatius has already given us. For example, in Rule 6, we learned that when we're in consolation, prayer is easier, and in desolation, we want to pray even more. So when we're in consolation, we build up the good habits that will then sustain us when we're in the desolation through prayer. Meditation, we learned about as well, as another one of the things that we should do in desolation. So if we're practicing that already when we're in consolation, then that we'll more easily be able to keep that going in times of desolation. That's important to remember the truths from the Lord, because the enemy tries to counteract that with lies during those times of desolation. We learned about Rule 7, that in desolation, God's help is still with us, even though we don't feel it. That's important to remind ourselves, when I'm in desolation, so right now in consolation, I'm feeling His closeness. He will be just as close to me when I don't feel it as now when I do. So that's Rule 7. Rule 8 tells us to be patient when we're in times of desolation, so reminding ourselves of that when we're in consolation. Rule number 9, as I already mentioned last time, we talked about the reasons for desolation, that God might allow it so that we can better learn what the real consolations really are. So we might think back in those times of consolation to our previous times of desolation and think about, how was God at work during those times of difficulty and darkness? How did He help me grow through that struggle? And even thinking back over it can help us to be able to meet the next desolation, maybe avoid some of the pitfalls that we fell into the previous time. Secondly, we can plan ahead for certain things that we know will happen in desolation. For example, maybe we didn't respond to desolation very well in the past. Maybe we didn't follow rule number 5, if you remember that one. We shouldn't make a change to our spiritual practices when we're in desolation. And maybe we did do that the last time we experienced desolation. We did make that change, and now we're like, okay, I need to make sure, remember that I don't do that. So I avoid that. For some people, when we go into prayer, journaling might be a help to them. So writing down reflections, thinking back as to what's going on in my spiritual life. So one lady, she was, during times of consolation, she'd write a letter to herself to be able to read when she was in desolation, to remind her of some of those things, remind her of the truths that happened, or that she could remember more clearly when it was easy to pray, but now that it's difficult, she needs that written reminder from herself. So something that you might find helpful, perhaps. So Rule 10 is all about preparing ahead. When we're in consolation, prepare ahead for those times of desolation, then it won't hit us so hard. Rule number 11 is also about this interaction between consolation and desolation, and it's about avoiding extremes. What do I mean by that? Well, when everything's going well in our life, and everything seems to be easy, and God's close and all that, we can be tempted to think, I'm doing so well, I've got it all figured out, and start relying upon ourselves only and not as much on God. We can become carelessly dependent upon myself, and that's going to set us up for a fall when the desolation comes. Conversely, when everything's going poorly, when we're in desolation, we can be tempted to despair, to think that things are never going to get better. It's always going to be this. I'm always going to be miserable. I don't see a way out. Nothing's going to happen. But Ignatius in rule number 11 is telling us to avoid these two extremes, right? Don't become naively high in consolation, thinking that I've got it all put together. But don't become despairingly low when we're in the desolation either. Instead, the attitude, he says, in consolation, we should be humble, recognizing that all that I'm experiencing is from the Lord, right? If it seems to be easy to follow God right now, thank you, Lord, because without you, I wouldn't be this way in this moment right now, right? So this humility that this doesn't just come from me, this is a gift from God. And to remember that I can do so little without him, right? It's only with the Lord. And then in desolation, so in consolation, it should be humility, and in desolation, it should be trust. I can do so much with God's grace. I don't feel the grace right now. I don't feel it, but I know it's there. And there's nothing that I can't overcome with his help. So we want to be humble in consolation and trusting in desolation. There's a great illustration of this from the scriptures in the story of Job. And I'm going to read something from St. Gregory the Great. He reflected on the story of Job. If you remember, Job is in the Old Testament. He's a man who has experienced great gifts and goodness from God, but then all sorts of tragedies and struggles and hardships hit him following all that goodness. And so right there at the beginning, as he's talking to his wife's a very interesting character. She tells Job that after all this happens, that he should just curse God and die. So, yeah. Fortunately, Job doesn't do that. Job instead responds, and he says to her, if we've received good from the hand of the Lord, why should we not endure evil? Right? If we receive the good things, we ought to receive the difficult things as well. And so St. Gregory the Great reflects on this and helps us understand this interplay between consolation and desolation, because that's really what's happening to Job there, right? The good things, consolation, or the bad things, the desolation. So St. Gregory the Great says, observe in Job's words how skillfully he meets his wife's persuadings. If we have received good from the hand of the Lord, why should we not endure evil? It is a great comfort in tribulation if in times of adversity we recall the gifts our Creator has given us, right? So that's the first part of Ignatius's rule. In the times of desolation or tribulation, recall the gifts that God has given to us in consolation. Gregory continues, nor will overwhelming sorrow break us if we quickly call to mind the gifts which have sustained us. For it is written, and now he quotes from the book of Sirach, on the day of prosperity do not forget affliction, and on the day of affliction do not forget prosperity. So this rule from St. Ignatius actually is based upon this proverb that comes from the scriptures. he continues, "For if a man receives God's gifts but forgets his affliction, he can fall through his excessive joy. On the other hand, when a man is bruised by scourges, but is not at all consoled by the thought of the blessings he has been fortunate to receive, he is completely cast down. Thus, both attitudes must be united so that one may be supported by the other. The memory of the gift can temper the pain of the affliction, and the foreboding and fear of the affliction can modify the joy of the gift. And so the holy Job, to soothe his soul's depression in the midst of his wound, weighs the delightful gifts he has received even while he suffers from the scourges, saying, 'If we have received good from the hand of the Lord, why should we not endure evil?'" Right, so there's a balance in his life. He's trying to avoid the extremes of the way that he's reacting both to the good and the difficult. Following this reflection of St. Gregory, it's another reflection I found by a Dominican brother, Brother Hyacinth Grubb. He'd be a modern writer. But in there, he reflects more upon this proverb from the book of Sirach, and rewords it slightly. That is helpful. On the day of prosperity, do not forget affliction. On the day of affliction, do not forget prosperity. That's what Sirach says. But we could rephrase that for New Testament times. On the day of your prosperity, do not forget Christ's affliction. And on the day of your affliction, do not forget Christ's prosperity. Because remembering Jesus' affliction during the times of consolation, that will fill us with gratitude, knowing that he's the one who's ransomed us from our futile conduct with the precious blood of Christ, as it says in 1 Peter. Remembering Jesus' affliction that he went through the cross in order for us to experience the consolation we have at that moment, that prevents us from regarding anything that we have as something we deserve. That is as if something that I came up with and I created on my own. Everything that we have is a gift. It's a blessing that we receive through Jesus. He's the one who merited salvation through his blood. We didn't merit to receive any of that on our own. So during our prosperity, remember Christ's affliction. But then on the other hand, remembering Christ's prosperity in the midst of our affliction, in the midst of our desolation. And that's more effective than any other kind of worldly comfort that we could go to, because that's where we often make mistakes in desolation. We try to find comfort in other stuff that ultimately doesn't give us comfort. But Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. His glorified body bears the wounds of his desolation. Right? He brings even his desolation, his passion, and yet he's there in unutterable bliss, there with his Father. And it's there in his Father's house where there are many rooms that he's prepared a place for us. Remembering that's what can bring us true and lasting consolation in times of our own affliction. So, in the day of your prosperity, do not forget Christ's affliction. And on the day of your affliction, do not forget Christ's prosperity. So, that'll lead us to our next Sunday Sparks. We'll have the final 3 rules of Ignatius's rules for discernment of spirit. And what those go through is certain tactics that the enemy will try to use, especially during the times of desolation. And we'll look at how to recognize that and how to resist what the enemy will do. So we'll finish with the final part of our prayer.